David Bowie, David Bowie, David Bowie.
It was pretty much exactly 2 years ago when I made myself listen to an entire David Bowie album for the first time. I was holding on to some unexamined, inherited prejudices, for sure. That's pretty much the whole point of my entire first season. So if you want the full backstory of my history with David Bowie, go back and watch episode 5 where I talk about Ziggy Stardust. Short version? Dad talked me out of thinking his music was cool. Since then, my opinion of Bowie has certainly mellowed. Songs like Fame, Golden Years, Life on Mars, when I listen, they no longer feel like guilty pleasures anymore. Still haven't gotten around to listening to Hunky Dory all the way through. Sorry, Brooks. Since the collection I inherited contains so much Bowie, I knew I wanted to include something. The trick was finding an album that could potentially fit in a season consisting largely of prog and fusion. So, Sean suggested the Berlin Trilogy. Low, Heroes, Lodger.
As you know, this season is primarily about progressive rock albums that maybe are a little less obvious. So you may be wondering why we're discussing David Bowie. Well, there's a lot to like in his catalog, and I have found that progressive rock fans are often fans of sophisticated pop music as well. And these 3 albums are definitely that and a lot more.
I don't know much about the music, but just looking at the personnel, it makes a little bit of sense, right? I mean, Brian Eno was involved in all 3, plus guitar work from Robert Fripp and Adrian Belew. So we're at least close.
The lesser hailed, but just as awesome guitarist on Low was named Ricky Gardner. He was a Scottish guitarist, and his quirky style, I think, fits the songs as well as Fripp and Belew do on their respective albums.
Thing is, I wasn't sure I wanted to devote 3 entire episodes to covering all 3 individually. So I decided to treat it as one giant 6-sided album thing. And to make sure I gave them enough time and attention, I scheduled them for the week after Thanksgiving, since I was going to be on the road for a week with the Allman Family Revival. Looking them over real quickly, I don't know that I've heard any of the songs on Low. None of them look familiar. But I know I've heard Heroes on Heroes and DJ on Lodger. Both of those tracks have that kind of Talking Heads arrangement style, you know? Intricately layered parts over simple changes without much in the way of like dividing it into verses and choruses or anything. I don't know that that's enough to set expectations on what I might hear on the rest of the 3 albums, though. Mostly I'm just curious. Okay, so that was wild. I think there might be too much for me to break all of the tracks down individually, but let's take a look at things in broader strokes. Low. It starts off with like 15 minutes or so of these short little song things.
Somewhere along the way, David decided to relocate to Berlin, Germany, and he really fell in love with the place. It was a great chance for him to get clean and get his mind back together. He was so out of it when he recorded Station to Station, he didn't even remember what town he did it in. It was done in Los Angeles, but he swears he has no memory of it. So this trilogy offers up more adventurous songwriting, and there aren't a lot of what you would call pop hits. On Low, I think Sound and Vision is probably the most accessible tune. Some of these songs are almost like fragments. They only last maybe 2 minutes. Side 1 is full of songs like this.
Like they were extracted from other longer songs, but then had all of these layers and textures added. Drums were manipulated, fuzzy synth parts were added, sometimes there were vocals, not always.
Low was a time for him to start over in a way and get away from his vices. I should go back a little bit and mention that before this he was working on an album with Iggy Pop. And that album in many ways is sort of tied to Low, as they were both sort of coming from the same mindset. And while he helped produce Iggy's album, it was important that he had his album come out first, because he didn't want anyone to think that his album was inspired by Iggy's, when in fact they were both coming from the same headspace.
The songs themselves were largely Velvet Underground style 2-chord affairs with simple rock grooves and simple melodies. Any complexity was in the arranging. But then side 2 of Low sounds like an entirely different album by a different artist in a different genre.
He was offered a chance to do a soundtrack for a movie called The Man Who Sold the World. So he started working on music for that, but somewhere along the way the producers decided they only wanted some of his songs. They didn't want him to do the entire soundtrack. And he was so upset by this that he decided to pull everything and not let them use any of his songs. But a lot of the music that was getting started actually came to fruition on Low, mostly stuff on side 2.
Those last 4 songs are 20th century minimalist compositions performed on a combination of electronic instruments, vocals, and sparse woodwinds.
Side 2 is all instrumental, and he was leaning in sort of the krautrock direction at the time and was inspired by groups like Tangerine Dream. Side 2 is sort of a love or hate situation. Folks that really like it think it's fantastic.
I don't know that I have a fully fleshed opinion of these pieces yet. So far, it seems a bit like things I've heard from Wendy Carlos, or Philip Glass, but with a sparseness and a directness that kind of hits the midpoint between the stark brutalism of Grigori Ligeti and the simple lyricism of Erik Satie. And I gotta say, at no point did I think I'd ever be discussing Ligeti or Satie after listening to a David Bowie album. Getting back to more familiar ground, Heroes starts with many of the same elements as Low, except the songs on side 1 had more in common with Talking Heads than with Velvet Underground. Heavier, funk-adjacent grooves, long pedal tones, intermittent bouts of guitar madness. And not just any guitar madness, Fripp-flavored guitar madness.
Heroes features a guitar part that's not far out of the realm of what Fripp was doing with his Frippertronics at the time.
Thank you very much, Rick James. I'm Robert Fripp, and this is Frippertronics.
When people think of Fripp and Bowie, Heroes always comes to mind first. But for my money, there's more Fripp on Scary Monsters, the album that follows Lodger. In fact, it's as adventurous as these 3 albums, and I consider it a companion to this trilogy.
But that same dense arrangement style you find on Low, the same buried layers of electronic fizz. And speaking of electronic, there were again some electronic compositions on side 2, but this time I felt a little bit more prepared. These instrumental pieces start off very much in the style of Ligeti again, but become more open and involved. There's even a koto at one point. And then there's Lodger. Lodger seems to me to have stronger songs in the traditional sense of the word, or at least songs that feel more like complete songs with verses and choruses and solos and everything.
I suppose we all have our favorites when it comes to this trilogy. I think mine would be Lodger. Tunes like Look Back in Anger are some of his most energetic songs.
He coughed and shook his crumpled wings, closed his eyes and moved his lips.
As a matter of fact, I vaguely remember seeing Bowie on Saturday Night Live in the late 70s. That's probably the first memory I have of him doing one of the songs off of Lodger.
Though less inventive, the arrangements are straighter, right? Fewer standout moments, at least when seen against the pattern created by the previous 2 albums.
While people seem to focus mostly on the lead guitarists on these 3 records, the rhythm guitarist Carlos Alomar is really David's right-hand man when it came to arranging the music for these records. And he's also the guitarist that played with David the most. You know, a lot of hot players would come and go over the years, but Carlos was always there on rhythm. You know, guys like Earl Slick on Station to Station, Fripp on Heroes and Scary Monsters, Ballou on Lodger, and Reeves Gabrels on some of the 90s works and beyond. All mad scientists of guitar. But meanwhile, Carlos is there holding it all together while they have their flights of fancy.
Also, no electronic minimalist compositions on Lodger. So just a couple of the standout moments for me from the Berlin Trilogy this first time around. Speed of Life. This song is mid-tempo, 70s glam sounding sort of a rock instrumental affair, only with some 80s underground sounds for the bass and the drums and the synth. There aren't that many chords and the melody is stupid simple. Honestly, it has no right being as ridiculously catchy as it is. It's kind of impressive in that regard. In listening to What in the World, it finally struck me that one of Bowie's signature moves is to craft a phrase that goes slightly longer than the form behind it, then repeat it so that the second iteration falls on different beats, and then follow that up with a third line that has the same metric foot, but different lyrics.
What in the world can I do? What in the world can I do? I'm in the mood for your love.
And speaking of lyrics, the lyrics of Be My Wife made me do one of those snort laugh things the first time I paid attention to what he was actually singing. Sometimes you get so lonely. Sometimes you get nowhere. I've been all over the world. I've been every place. It's charming, isn't it? That kind of fumbling awkwardness. Not what you expect from, Mr. Put Together David Bowie, right? A new career in a new town. Ultra hip glam rock vibe with, of all things, a blues harp over the top of it. Definitely wouldn't have called that. Beauty and the Beast. Here's what I hear. Start with an early Talking Heads tune, right? Something from like Fear of Music or More Songs About Building and Food, one of the early ones. And then give it the Remain in Light treatment with the layered frippy guitar and synth parts, the metronome perfect timing, and then give those instrumental tracks to Bowie for him to compose lyrics and sing. Honestly, a good portion of Heroes sounds like that to me to some degree, but Beauty and the Beast in particular. Sons of the Silent Age. There are so many interesting little musical moments in this song. You throw in a Lydian fourth here or a minor modulation there. But then the chorus, right? The chorus is this ornate shifting thing with a set of changes that, to me, sound like they would come straight from the Great American Songbook. And no matter how many times I listened to the chorus, I couldn't shake the feeling that the melody reminds me of something. It wants to make a connection in my brain, but I can't quite find it. It's driving me nuts. The Secret Life of Arabia. 2 words. Semantic satiation. And the moments from Lodger. Well, after listening to Low and Heroes one after the next, the thing that stood out to me immediately was the prominent featuring of Adrian Belew, where Robert Fripp's parts on Heroes felt to me like he was being integrated into the composition. On songs like Red Sails, DJ, and Boys Keep Swinging, it feels to me as if Belew was being given a separate spotlight that was built upon, but not always directly related to, the rest of the song. A solo, if you will.
Adrian Belew really shines on Lodger, brings a lot of his guitar style that would be very prevalent in a few years on King Crimson's Discipline. All the elephant sounds, crazy tapping and bizarre soloing and whammy bar work.
Overall, these 3 albums constitute one of the more memorable first spins of music in my recent experience. Not necessarily for an immediate connection to the music, but more for the upturning of expectations and the stylistic challenge.
After that, he did Let's Dance, which was decidedly commercial, hooking up with Nile Rodgers, who was, the funk rhythm guitar master from Chic, who had become a go-to producer in the 80s for the likes of Madonna and other folks like that. Had some amazing hits, and you can't deny something like Let's Dance is infectious and timeless in its own way, but for fans that were used to Bowie's more quirky style, it was a bit of a sellout.
Before I get into my reflections, I think I need to start with a couple words of caution. There's a lot about my feelings for Low, Heroes, and Lodger that are deeply tied to many different facets of my life these past 2 weeks. Let me give you an example. Well, for anyone who's ever seen Blue Velvet, I can't imagine that their relationship to the Roy Orbison song In Dreams is the same after seeing the movie.
A candy-colored clown they call the Sandman.
So much of this music's impact on me has to do with things like tour life, liminal spaces, the novels of Haruki Murakami, Jungian theories of persona and shadow, and specifically how those ideas relate to the Persona video game series, and a good amount of my own tangled and oddly branched psyche. If none of that sounds interesting to you, you'll probably have a bad time with the rest of this video. I guess this set of events all started about a month ago when I started my 4th replay of Persona 5. And this is where I should spend about 6 paragraphs explaining what Persona 5's main storyline is about and why it's important. But honestly, Persona 5 is just the outer shell of this liminal nesting doll I found myself inside. And explaining each layer would make this video 2 hours long. And who the hell wants that? So for those of you that know that story, or for those of you that have studied some Jungian psychology, keep those things in mind when I tell you also that the next thing is I decided to reread Haruki Murakami's A Wild Sheep Chase and Dance, Dance, Dance after I found out that they are in fact one continuous story. So as I was doing this, playing the game, reading the book, playing the game, reading the book, I started to notice all manner of similarities, and the two worlds started living on top of each other. It got to a point where I would hear the appropriate Persona 5 background music to fit the mood of the section of the book I was reading. Persona 5's music is particularly amazing. And then I was uprooted from home and sent on the road for a week with the Allman Family Revival. And honestly, it was one of the best touring experiences of my life. Everyone was easy to work with, from the management to the techs to the musicians. Everyone was a decent person, no stress, no drama. I met a bunch of people I now consider to be friends, and I look forward to spending more time with them. Including, by the way, Roy Orbison's son, Alex. But for those of you that don't know, being on road, being on tour, is being cut loose from the world. Inhabiting strangely architected buildings. Eating bowls of spaghetti while sitting around folding tables in a gymnasium while a jazzercise class is going on in the next room. And in this environment of nested liminality, space upon mind upon subconscious, all of them merging into a single unreality, this is where I met the Berlin Trilogy. So these little experimental song pieces followed me among the lizards crawling between the coral in the rocks by Sarasota Bay, while sitting in a cute little apartment of Kiki and Tiki among the daybed and the roller skates and the performance review, tapping my order in for the 3rd Wawa sandwich in as many days while standing by a display of holiday cookies and having it get me a little bit choked up. This soundtrack at this time was deeply affecting to me in ways that are impossible for me to articulate because you're not me and you weren't in my head when it happened. So I have no way of knowing whether Bowie's Berlin Trilogy is objectively good. A lot of people like it, so there's some evidence that it might be. But even after 2 weeks, all I can do is offer my assurance that these are now important albums to me. That's the best I can give you.